Very pleased and proud to welcome an extraordinary man who I am happy to call an old friend as well. Edgar Mitchell. Ed is one of the people who actually walked on the moon. In fact, he's the sixth man to walk on the moon. I'm sure every one of you know exactly who Ed Mitchell is. He literally needs no introduction, but what does need an introduction, and it's getting it here, is an extraordinary book, The Way of the Explorer. Larry Dossey said of it, and I thought this was particularly apt of the many, many comments that Edgar got for this book. In the history of the human race, 12 people have set foot on the moon. Now, one of them has written an important book, an account of a modern-day hero's journey. Like the mythical heroes of legend, Astronaut Mitchell pursued a vision, ventured on a quest, risked great danger, and obtained uncommon wisdom. He has returned to share it, and we would be wise to listen. Yes, indeed, we would. And over the course of the program, as I am sure Edgar well knows, we will be talking also about aliens. By the way, for you subscribers, one of the other people who has given Edgar a lovely quote for his book, Lynn McTaggart, is our featured subscriber interview this week. And Ed, I think in view of that, I might start out by departing a little bit from, if I have a script, and I never really do, and asking you what your thoughts are about the Lynn McTaggart and the intention experiment. We're going to get into the quantum physical nature of consciousness as Ed sees it a little later, but let's just start there since we're talking also today to Lynn McTaggart.
I have skimmed her new book. I have not personally read every word of it through, Whitley, but of course her first book, The Field, I'm very intimately involved with, and I appreciate Lynn's approach. I know that she's a very thorough researcher, but I can't speak to the details of this newest book because I haven't read it word for word all the way through yet.
Well, let's really. I guess I misspoke myself because I meant to say that I'd like to talk about the theory of the field and to move from that into your idea of quantum awareness.
Okay.
And I think that I think you could probably make it a bit more of a response to that.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I certainly agree that in recent years we have, and fortunately in large measure due to some work a colleague of mine did that Lynn McTaggart's quite well aware of, Dr. Walter Schimp in Germany, discovered this process called quantum holography when he was doing work with improving MRI machines. He's an MRI expert. And it really brings into clear focus the role of the quantum world in our perceptual machinery and in the concept of the quantum field as an underlying aspect of nature that we're just now really starting to learn a bit about. And primarily because for 80 years since the discovery of quantum mechanics, the particle physicists have insisted that it really didn't pertain to our scale size, that this was a property only of subatomic matter. Well, it so happens that it may be a property of subatomic matter, but it has enormous influence because we have a lot of subatomic matter in us, too, on the way humans function, and particularly our perceptual machinery.
Exactly, and this is incredibly important because let's talk about a little bit about the so-called quantum perception problem so folks can get a bit of an idea about just how important this actually is. Because if perception influences reality or even assembles reality in some way, then our place in the universe is actually very different from what we've assumed. Wouldn't that be true?
That's absolutely correct. And what we're getting past here is the classical physics that stems from the time of Isaac Newton, but for our readers to understand this, that the Cartesian duality from René Descartes of the late 16th, early 17th century came to the conclusion that body, mind, physicality, spirituality belong to two different realms of reality that don't interact. Now, the fine aspect of that, the positive aspect of that, was it got the Inquisition of the Church of that period off the backs of the intellectuals, and they quit burning them at the stake and torturing them on the rack, which was what the Inquisition did in those days with dissenters. And it did allow a science, as we now understand it in the classical period of Newton and the early great thinkers, to arise. But it has progressed for almost 400 years with religion on one hand and science on the other, and never the twain shall meet, until the 20th century and quantum mechanics came along and clearly indicated that there was something here wrong with that notion that body, mind, physicality, and spirituality don't interact. And it's very clear that they do interact now. And that is the major contribution in the 20th century here of quantum mechanics, and particularly the new stuff that's been going on in just the last few years, thanks to much of the work that I've been doing, Lynn McTaggart's been doing, and many of the great thinkers associated here with the consciousness movement.
Now let's talk a little bit about quantum awareness and how it's different from ordinary awareness. And in this audience that you're talking to now is engaged in an intense search. It's an audience of about 250,000 people, and they are not like your usual radio audience. These people they know what this is. So when we talk about quantum awareness, you're talking to people who are actively engaged in trying to rethink or re-experience their awareness and the way they work in relation to the universe itself.
Okay, well, maybe I can lay a little background here that at least from the academic end and the teaching end and the scientific end, that helps get the proper idea across. Because we need to understand what is different about classical thinking in physics and in science rather than quantum thinking in science. And it has to do with four properties of nature that define the quantum world, and that is entanglement, coherence, non-locality, and resonance. That are the aspects of the quantum world that are vitally important here. Entanglement is this notion that subatomic matter that becomes in a process, and even if the particles go apart from each other, even across the universe, they remain entangled in some very mysterious way, such that if you do something to one particle, the other one immediately and instantaneously responds regardless of where it is in the universe.
Right, and the interesting thing about this is, folks, this has been physically proved. It's not.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, there have been experiments that have shown this is definitely real.
Yes, that's correct. It is a real phenomenon. And that this shows that it goes right to the heart of the fact that the universe is mysteriously in some way interconnected, and we will call this an informational interconnection at that level. That still has a lot of mystery associated with it. And non-locality, which is part one of these, coherence, that these two particles are coherent in a way. A way to think of coherence, if you think of it as light waves being coherent, it means that their waves are all lined up kind of in a row like soldiers marching, as opposed to being like just ordinary light coming in where the waveforms are in all sorts of angles and not lined up in any way. The light that comes through your window and from the sun is not coherent light, but laser light is coherent light. And laser light is what we've discovered. But what we've now discovered is that that nature was using this property long before we discovered it. And that's quite that's a very interesting observation. And then non-locality is the idea that this information between the two is transported, or is the interaction is instantaneously recognized, regardless of where the other part is in the universe. Well, this kind of challenges Einstein's concept that information doesn't move faster than the speed of light. But here we have validated that this is absolutely true, that it does. Exactly how this happens, still the methodology and the mechanism for it is still very elusive, but the fact that it does happen, that's not in question anymore. And a couple of other things to illustrate this among we humans is a so-called twin effect, that twins who are on opposite sides of the country from each other, or around the world from each other, might on even any given day dress in the same color clothes or have the same sort of thoughts or be in kind of communication with each other. Another example is mom and dad go out for dinner at night and leaving Johnny at home with the babysitter, and halfway through dinner, mom jumps up and says, "Oh, something's happened to Johnny." Calls home, babysitter answers, says, "Well, yes, he fell out of his high chair onto his head and bumped his head." Well, that's the type of information, we call it quantum coherence or quantum entanglement and quantum resonance that allows that to take place. And go ahead.
Now that we're seeing this, it becomes possible, and this is why I see such a relationship between your work and the work of someone like Lynn McTaggart, is that you are leading the way into a new possibility, which is that once we understand the theory that would explain what is now dismissed by science as mere psychic activity or superstition, then suddenly everything changes, because in the quantum nature of the mind, once we understand this in our linear mind, it's going to enable our quantum mind to function more freely. Now, Edgar, we've come to the quantum minds. We've come to the end of our first segment, so we're going to stop here for just a moment, folks, and we'll be right back. Today I'm talking to one of the great explorers of our time, Dr. Edgar Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell's new book is The Way of the Explorer, an Apollo astronaut's journey through the material and mystical worlds, and it is powerful. This is a working document for those of you who are working on creating or recreating your mind as a quantum mind, and I know a lot of you are, because this is what we work on our meditations all the time in the subscribers section. Well, this book helps because it brings into coherent understanding and ceases to make mysterious things that are mysterious now, and this empowers us. So it's incredibly exciting. Edgar's website is edmitchellapollo14.com, and that's the numbers 14. That's edmitchellapollo14.com. And of course, he's the founder of the Institute for Noetic Sciences, and this is a marvelous and extraordinary organization that you are much commended to get involved in. It is Noetic, Noetic.org. And the Institute of Noetic Sciences is taking certain things very, very far, and it is well worth your time. Edgar, when we left the air, we were beginning to talk about the quantum mind. And what, if you could describe for us what is the quantum mind? How would it be different?
Okay, sure. First of all, let's use a couple of metaphors to get the idea across. We have called intuition our sixth sense, but in fact, we should be calling it our first sense because it's rooted in quantum reality and quantum properties, which have been around long before our solar system or our planet has. It's the most basic way that nature transmits information, and so we can call that our sixth sense, or rather our first sense instead of our sixth sense. Now, in addition, one of the properties that helps us recognize this is that we have a mechanism called a Faraday cage, which screens out electromagnetic signaling. And waves like radio waves and television waves can't get through a Faraday cage, but we can put parents, our lovers, our parents and children, or any people that are simpatico or know each other, one inside a Faraday cage and the other outside, wire them up to EEG machines, and tell them to think about each other. And lo and behold, in spite of the fact that they're separated by a Faraday cage and screening, their brain waves can go in sync. And this is one way we test all of that. And it so happens we test it continually, and it's the way the world works here. And so the very basis of our perceptual machinery, and it explains all of our psychic stuff, but it's even the basis for our normal perception, is rooted in these quantum properties of nature that we're talking about.
So what we're looking at then is the actual truth is that the linear mind is a kind of filter. It's not the real mind. And this is about working around or realizing that filter is just that. Ironically, the illusion isn't quantum reality. The illusion is mechanistic reality. Would that be directionally correct?
Well, yes. I think we have to say that our perceptual mechanisms require both, because our normal sensory mechanisms, the 5 so-called normal senses, are built upon the particular attributes of the solar system and the planetary system that we live in. So our visual acuity is attuned to the brightness and the lightness of light produced by our sun. Our acoustic ability, listening and hearing, is due to the particular constituents of our atmosphere. So we evolved being able to utilize that sort of information. But the very basis of it is a quantum reality. Now, we have learned to use this, for example, let me digress and use this for this example, that in our telescopes, in the great astronomical observatories,
right,
in Hawaii and in Chile and et cetera,
right,
they have a way of reducing the twinkle, and it's tied with exactly what we're talking about. To see clearer into the heavens is that you have to eliminate the twinkle or the waveforms that are disturbed by the light coming through the atmosphere of our planet. And they do that by sending a laser beam into the atmosphere, catching the reflection from that laser beam back, because that represents the atmospheric interference, and removing the image from the image of the light, this noise, and getting a very clear picture of the heavens. That's using lasers to correct for the atmospheric interference, and we know how to do that. And the same thing is true here with our brain-mind. When we learn how to meditate and use our brain-mind differently, we can eliminate the noise. We can start to get more clear signaling. And the ancients have been doing this and knowing this for centuries. For centuries,
yes.
It's as if, with our meditation techniques.
It's as if we're recovering something, not discovering something here.
Yes, that's right. We're recovering. And with our thinking minds, our rational thinking brains, as we discovered to use that and used our language, we started to abandon these deep intuitive things. Now, we've always had them, but we've focused more on our rational thinking brain mind than we have on the deep mind, that carries this sort of information.
The way of the explorer kept hitting me between the eyes, Edgar, and one of the most powerful sentences I've ever read anywhere, folks, and this is because this sentence deals so directly with exactly the kind of change we are all looking for and we know is out there. Listen to this. Non-local resonance with any part of the space-time universe should be attainable by shifting one's point of focus to the 0 point, for it resonates with all matter. Now that reads to me, Edgar, like a practical, down-to-earth, meditative technique, which I suspect that is there. And the question first is, and this is amply discussed in this marvelous book, is your definition of the 0 point. When we are out there in our meditative space, what are we looking for when we're looking for the 0 point?
Well, first of all, let's define what we're talking about here. It was discovered over a century ago by the great physicist Max Planck that all matter emits and reabsorbs energy and photons of energy. And at that point in history, we still weren't sure whether light was a particle or a wave, and the argument's been going back since Greek times. But at that point in time, Einstein and Max Planck and the physicists of that period came to the conclusion. Einstein wrote the famous paper that said light is either particle or wave, depending upon what experiment you do with it. So it has both aspects. And very shortly we discovered that all matter at that level has both wave and particle aspects, depending upon the experiments you do with it. Well, that was the beginning of quantum mechanics. Now, what the physicists have done for almost 80 years, once they discovered that, was they kept studying and deeper, how do these little particles split up, recombine, what's their properties? But what they didn't do was look at it until very recently as the fact that as a group, and now let me use this idea to get it across. If you look at your fingertip and you look at the ridge on your finger, it doesn't tell you much about you. But if you look at the pattern of ridges on all 10 fingers and think of it as a pattern, that's your fingerprint. It uniquely identifies you. Well, what a colleague of mine in Europe, Dr. Walter Schempp, did about 15 years ago now, was study this as a group of emissions, and he discovered that if you consider the group emissions from every physical object, it carries unique information about that physical object, and it doesn't matter whether it's a light bulb in your house, your chair, your dog, an organ of your body. Everything is emitted and reabsorbing this energy, and in some areas, and sometimes we call that an aura. I mean, it's got many properties, but one of the properties that Schempp discovered was that the photons are non-local and are interconnected, and they carry information. Now, to leap a little bit ahead, the ancients knew this, but they didn't know it quite the way we do it with quantum mechanics, and they called that particular property the Akashic record. And
it's absolutely fascinating because we've speculated on this show for years about the nature of the Akashic record. Fascinating. Go ahead.
Well, exactly what we're talking about here is that Dr. Schempp discovered precisely that the emissions from each physical object, when considered as a group and managed with a particular mathematics called the nilpotent Dirac-Heisenberg Lie group algebra. Now, that's a mouthful. Don't worry about it. But
right.
That's the mathematics involved. And he discovered that we have this quantum property, and it is a non-local property, and it carries information about us, and it is the basis. And I happened to discover then, I wrote a paper called nature's mind, the quantum hologram, because that's exactly how our psychic stuff works. And this has been slowly filtering into the community, scientific community, as these ideas are being accepted more and more.
And folks, I just want to point out briefly that you can read that paper on Edgar's website, edmitchellapollo14.com. Go ahead, Ed.
Thank you. Well, we consider that this discovery of Dr. Simp's has opened an entirely new door for us to look at biology, to look at the questions of, well, what is really life, and what is the difference between, we think, we're told chemically that our bodies are made up of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, or oxygen primarily, but we ask the question, what's the difference between the carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen in our bodies and what's in the inanimate stuff out in nature? Well, one of the answers is it's all quantum entangled, and only now are we really starting to understand that.
Which is a huge, huge thing. And, folks, we're going to drop the break because I'm too excited. I can't go on a break right now. So, please, if you don't subscribe to Unknown Country, do so. That's what keeps this all going. Okay, let's continue. Now, what you're saying there leads me to think, you speak a little bit in the book about remote viewing, and you've had experience of it. You know that it works. Are you saying that this entanglement with the rest of the world is what enables, it's the mechanism that enables things like remote viewing to happen?
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely true.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely true.
And how far does entanglement go?
Well, what do you mean by how far?
Well, I mean, are we entangled? We're entangled with the world around us, but are we entangled, therefore, with the whole universe, or?
Well, that's a good question. You see, we can't really experiment much beyond what we can observe in our universe, but it would seem so. If the laws of physics are the same in our universe, throughout our universe, as most scientists believe that they are, then yes, these same principles apply. Now, we can say for sure that has been tested, if we have molecules entangled in a particular process, they are entangled, and they exhibit these properties until they get entangled somewhere else. But there's this entanglement. And presumably, if the Big Bang is really the right answer to how all of our reality came about, then everything is entangled. But
it must be, because it all started out as a tiny, super dense object the size of a fist or a golf ball.
That is true, except for the fact there's a great deal of doubt at this point in time in many quarters, not all quarters, it's standard academic dogma. There's considerable doubt that the Big Bang is really the right answer to all of this.
Well, which is in and of itself fascinating. I do know that there is a group of cosmologists who announced a few months ago, in December, that they thought that a 9 billion light-year gap in the universe that they have observed is an indication that another entire universe... What did you say?
Yeah, that another universe or even another set of processes are taking place.
Right, beyond what we can see, beyond the limits of our own universe.
One of the things we have to recognize here that keeps us all fairly humble, or should, is the fact that when we start to think about and you look at the photographs from the Hubble telescope into the immensity of everything that we could see, and we've only had these photographs working for us for the last decade or so, we're only just now discovering really the immensity of what we call our universe. And we are really very ignorant, frankly. We're just barely out of the trees when it comes to really understanding what's going on. So we think we're pretty smart, and yes, our science of the late 20th, 19th, and 20th century, and now the 21st century is carrying us very fast. But, folks, we still got a long ways to go.
Well, yeah, because, you speak of us being just recently out of the trees. In the Earth's time, in geologic time, we have only been around for less than a geologic second.
Absolutely.
We are, you talk about peripheral and transient phenomena. Human intelligence is extremely peripheral and extremely transient right now. Edgar, and this is an outrageously unfair question, but you are probably one of the only people on Earth I would ever ask this and expect to hear an answer that's worth hearing, and that is, where do you think we are going?
Where we're going, where we're going is where we choose to go, and right now we are imperiling our entire environment because we're not being very wise. At this point in our history, since the end of the 19th and throughout the 20th century, we have had an upturn in all activity, just because of the genius of our science and our technology people, because of the sudden influence of modern medicine and extending the lifespan. Population, which was less than 2 billion people on the Earth at the beginning of the 20th century, is over 6.5 billion now, so we've far more than tripled ourselves in 1 century. And upshot of it is that every measure of human activity is on an exponential growth curve. Every measure of human activity is on an exponential growth curve.
Yeah, and mathematically,
that means that the rate is fast. The rate of change is changing faster also. And it doesn't take great genius to understand that exponential growth can't continue indefinitely in a finite space, and we live on a finite planet.
Right.
So something's got to give. Something's got to change, and we caused it. We got to change it. So that is the current dilemma of modern civilization that we're facing right now, Whitley, and I'm sure you know that too.
Absolutely, of course.
Part of our sustainability.
I've written some books about it.
Yeah. So that's the major lesson. And so where we're going is where we have to go. We either got to wake up and start to protect our environment, cut back on our insane consumption, and start to learn how to live in cooperation with each other, or we're going to extinguish ourselves.
You have said, and this takes me in a slightly different direction. You've said some of the more interesting things about the possibility of alien presence in this world than that I've heard, and of course you and I have personally talked about it since I had an extensive amount of contact with something or somebody.
Yep.
And so I have wondered what I see two things happening. I see the world is in this state exactly that you describe, and at the same time, I see this other presence that is sort of like it's if I may use a kind of a simple analogy, it's like some enormous presence, immensely knowledgeable, more than a little dangerous, and more than a little potentiating to us, kind of sticking a little stick into the ant nest and rubbing it around a bit and causing us to look up. And I'm wondering how you react to that.
Well, you, of course, have not come right out and said it, but I know we've been visited and have had it, although I have not had personal sighting of our visitors or personal sighting of UFOs. I have been briefed by, since I grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, by the way, which our readers may not know, our listeners may not know.
Yeah, I was actually going to get to that very soon. It's quite remarkable. And when we're going to take a break in a couple of minutes, folks, and when we come back, we'll talk about a little bit about Edgar's rather the amazing milieu in which he was raised, and then what happened on the Apollo 14 mission. But let's go ahead with this now.
Well, I grew up in Roswell. I knew many of the people, local people, or my family did, involved in the so-called Roswell incident. And so, to make a long story short, there's no doubt that it was covered up that the Roswell incident was a valid visitation, that an accident did happen there, the crashed UFO. And not only have I had that confirmed by folks that my family knew in the Roswell area, but over the years, because of my astronaut experience, what I called old-timers contacted me, or somehow we came together, that were knowledgeable in this because they were there. They were either in the military or they were in the intelligence service or sometime at that point and had these types of experiences or were involved with it. And so I, at one point, went to the Pentagon because I had connections there and asked to talk to some fairly high-level people, which a meeting was set up. And so I showed I told what I knew. And the officer there, who was quite a high-level officer, said, I don't know about this, but I should know about this because it should be. That's part of my job. And so a few weeks later, he went back and said, you're right. And then he started to try to break in because he said, this should be my job. I should be in charge of this. And he was denied access. Now, we know that quite a number of our people over the years, since the 1950s, when all of this started to take place, have been denied access. But it's opening up fairly rapidly these days after all of this time. And I have the feeling that before very long, the fact of alien presence will be quite well accepted and quite, whether it will really be fully acknowledged, I don't know. But certainly a number of governments around the world that are well aware of this, like the Belgian government, the French government, the Brazilian government, the Mexican government, have fully acknowledged their files and their knowledge of the UFO phenomenon.
Folks, we're going to take a little break right now. We'll be right back. We're talking to Dr. Ed Mitchell. His new book, The Way of the Explorer, an Apollo astronaut's journey through the material and mystical worlds. Do not miss this, because if you are on this journey into quantum mind, as I know most of you listening to this are, this book is important. It's real important. Don't miss it. The information in here is valuable. It will help you take this journey. Ed is probably the world's leading explorer for the simple reason that he not only has he walked on the moon among the sixth man to do so, but he has taken the potency or the magic or the power of that journey and internalized it and re-expressed it as a new journey into inner and outer space that all of us can take. Don't miss his website, edmitchellapollo14.com, and explore the Institute for Noetic Sciences as well. That's noetic.org, Noetic.org. Now, Edgar, let's begin this last segment together, going back to the moon and to that remarkable experience that really empowered your whole journey. What exactly happened? That sense of connectedness that you talk about. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure.
Because that's what we're really looking at here.
Be glad to do that, Whitney. Let's set it up for our listeners. Because I was a lunar module pilot, and my responsibilities were the lunar spacecraft and the lunar surface activities, to know those like the back of my hand and be an expert in them. And on the way home, since my major job had been completed successfully, and I was a systems engineer on a well-functioning homebound spacecraft, I had a little more time to look out the window and gawk and be less concerned with things than my two partners, who still were supervising and carrying out experiments. And I was working too, but they were responsible for that. So I had the chance to look out and look at the heavens and be a little more of a tourist on the way home. And we were in the plane of the ecliptic, and perhaps many people saw one of the recent the lunar eclipse last night, as a matter of fact.
Right. This is being recorded on the 21st of February, folks, and you'll hear this toward the end of the month or early March.
So we were in the plane of the ecliptic, which is the plane containing the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun, and oriented perpendicular to it and rotating in order to keep thermal balance on the spacecraft. And that allowed the view of the Earth, the Moon, the Sun, and a 360-degree panorama of the heavens to appear every 2 minutes in the spacecraft window. And this was utterly magnificent view, and you must recognize that in space the stars are 10 times as bright and 10 times as numerous as you can ever see on Earth, and that's because of the lack of intervening atmosphere. And it's much closer to what we can now see with the Hubble telescope pictures that's brought back from Hubble. And anyhow, I recognize in looking at this that from my studies of astronomy at MIT and Harvard when I was getting my doctorate, that the molecules of my body and the molecules in the body of the spacecraft and my partners had been manufactured in some ancient generation of stars. And instead of intellectual knowledge, it was suddenly a visceral recognition, an insight, accompanied by ecstasy, and I'd never had this experience before. It was just overwhelmingly powerful. And every time I looked out the spacecraft window in the midst of my duties for the next 3 days, I was overtaken with this insight and the power of this. And I realized that for all time, we humans have asked the very deep questions about who are we, how did we get here, and where we're going. And each generation and each civilization has had its answer. But that now we were a spacefaring civilization, and my generation was the first generation of spacefarers, that maybe we needed to re-ask that deep question from this point of view. And I recognized that our story of ourselves, the cosmology of our science, was certainly incomplete and perhaps flawed. And the story of ourselves, as told by our cultural cosmologies rooted in religion, was probably was archaic and perhaps flawed. And maybe we needed to re-ask that question. So here I came home with this experience happening for 3 days coming home, just blowing me away. And I got home, started looking in the literature to find out what all this meant, and could find nothing in science and nothing in this religious literature. So I turned to some scholars over to nearby university, Rice University in Houston, be specific, and asked them to help me. And very shortly they came up with, out of the ancient Sanskrit in India, several thousand years old, the description called Salvakapa Samadhi, a mind state in which you see things in their separateness and in the way we see them, but sense them internally as a unity, as a oneness, and accompanied by ecstasy. And I said, well, when they presented this to me, I said, that's exactly what was happening, is that I could see all of this, but I was feeling absolutely blown away and excited and overwhelmed by the utter beauty and the unity of all of this. So I then, from that point, started delving into the cultures of various civilizations. And I talked to medicine men and kahuna in Hawaii and shamans from Tibetan Buddhism and the mystical and spiritual leaders of as many different cultures as I could get a hold of, and found that in every culture of the world, these types of experiences were somehow recorded in the lore and in the literature or in the verbal lore of that culture. And I realized that that was a common experience of we humans, and that it is probably rooted in the very fundamental ground of our being. Some would call that God, but I would call that the zero-point energy field.
Well, this leads me into what I thought was one of the most powerful reading experiences I've had in a long time. And the whole book is powerful, and it's very coherent. That's what's so exciting about it, is that so often the material that we are dealing with is not quite coherent, and because people are struggling with their inner focus, we don't know quite where we are with this yet. But you seem to, very much so. And anyway, chapter 25, Portraits of Reality, it brings up things like the proposed multidimensional universe being one result of the search, and then speculations as to the world disappearing when no one is looking. In other words, the speculation that everything is in superposition, and I think most of my listeners know what that is, but in any case, superposition is a state where an electron or any subatomic particle is not in any particular place. It's nowhere and everywhere at once until it's perceived, whereupon it becomes a particle again. And is it possible, do you think, to use this principle, this fact of nature, and it is a fact of nature because we can actually detect it. We know that it's true. In meditation in some way, to allow our minds to expand, as it were, into the universe. And we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. God help you.
Well, so certainly what you've just described is a fundamental enigma of the basis of quantum mechanics. But Einstein and Bohr all argued about it, and that was Einstein's statement: does the moon go away when you close your eyes and you're not looking at it? And, of course, we know it doesn't. But at the very basis of the particle wave argument at the bottom of quantum mechanics is this superposition principle, where we can't really know exactly where a particle is at any given time. We can only know it probably. And so let's not get into all of that at this point because it's so very basic to some very arcane arguments. But the universe as we perceive it is it's just like we see it, except for the fact there's this level down deep that things are happening kind of very much like at the subatomic level, the way they're described in quantum mechanics in this way. It's exciting because that is the basis. It's the fundamental basis for how our world is put together.
Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, a man who has now journeyed far, far beyond the moon, as close to the edges of the universe as I think we have as yet gotten. His new book, The Way of the Explorer, don't miss it. And don't miss his website, Dr. Ed Mitchell, Apollo14.com, and the Institute for Noetic Science awaits your interest and participation. Ed, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Whitney. It's been good to talk to you, as always.
Yes, indeed. Edgar, a lovely quote for his book. Lynn McTaggart is our featured subscriber interview this week. And Ed, I think in view of that, I might start out by departing a little bit from, if I have a script, and I never really do, and asking you what your thoughts are about the Lynn McTaggart and the intention experiment. We're going to get into the quantum physical nature of consciousness as Ed sees it a little later, but let's just start there, since we're talking also today to Lynn McTaggart. I have skimmed her new book. I have not personally read every word of it through, Whitley, but of course her first book, The Field, I'm very intimately involved with, and I appreciate Lynn's approach. I know that she's a very thorough researcher, but I can't speak to the details of this newest book because I haven't read it word for word all the way through yet. Well, let's really. I guess I misspoke myself because I meant to say that I'd like to talk about the theory of the field and to move from that into your idea of quantum awareness
Oh, okay.
And I think that I think you could probably make it a bit more of a.
Now understand it in the classical period of Newton and the early great thinkers to arise, but it has progressed for almost 400 years with religion on one hand and science on the other, and never the twain shall meet, until the 20th century and quantum mechanics came along and clearly indicated that there was something here wrong with that notion that body, mind, physicality, and spirituality don't interact. And it's very clear that they do interact now. And that is the major contribution in the 20th century here of quantum mechanics, and particularly the new stuff that's been going on in just the last few years, thanks to much of the work that I've been doing, Lynn McTaggart's been doing, and many of the great thinkers associated here with the consciousness movement.
Now let's talk a little bit about quantum awareness and how it's different from ordinary awareness. And in this audience that you're talking to now is engaged in an intense search. It's an audience of about 250,000 people, and they are not like your usual radio audience. These people they know what this is. Let's talk about a little bit about the so-called quantum perception problem, so folks can get a bit of an idea about just how important this actually is. Because if perception influences reality, or even assembles reality in some way, then our place in the universe is actually very different from what we've assumed. Wouldn't that be true?
That's absolutely correct. And what we're getting past here is the classical physics that stems from the time of Isaac Newton. But for our readers to understand this, that the Cartesian duality from René Descartes of the late 16th, early 17th century came to the conclusion that body, mind, physicality, spirituality belong to two different realms of reality that don't interact. Now, the fine aspect of that, the positive aspect of that, was it got the Inquisition of the Church of that period off the backs of the intellectuals, and they quit burning them at the stake and torturing them on the rack, which was what the Inquisition did in those days with dissenters. And it did allow a science as we...
Response to that.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I certainly agree that in recent years we have, and fortunately in large measure due to some work a colleague of mine did, that Lynn McTaggart's quite well aware of, Dr. Walter Schimp in Germany, discovered this process called quantum holography when he was doing work with improving MRI machines. He's an MRI expert. And it really brings into clear focus the role of the quantum world in our perceptual machinery and in the concept of the quantum field as an underlying aspect of nature that we're just now really starting to learn a bit about. And primarily because for 80 years since the discovery of quantum mechanics, the particle physicists have insisted that it really didn't pertain to our scale size, that this was a property only of subatomic matter. Well, it so happens that it may be a property of subatomic matter, but it has enormous influence because we have a lot of subatomic matter in us, too, on the way humans function, and particularly our perceptual machinery.
Exactly, and this is incredibly important because very pleased and proud to welcome an extraordinary man who I am happy to call an old friend as well. Edgar Mitchell. Ed is one of the people who actually walked on the moon. In fact, he's the sixth man to walk on the moon. I'm sure every one of you know exactly who Ed Mitchell is. He literally needs no introduction, but what does need an introduction, and it's getting it here, is an extraordinary book, The Way of the Explorer. Larry Dossey said of it, and I thought this was particularly apt of the many, many comments that Edgar got for this book. In the history of the human race, 12 people have set foot on the moon. Now, one of them has written an important book, an account of a modern-day hero's journey. Like the mythical heroes of legend, Astronaut Mitchell pursued a vision, ventured on a quest, risked great danger, and obtained uncommon wisdom. He has returned to share it, and we would be wise to listen. Yes, indeed, we would. And over the course of the program, as I am sure Edgar well knows, we will be talking also about aliens. By the way, for you subscribers, one of the other people who has given